Functions are an important part of JavaScript. They're a way that we can store code to call later in our programs. In these videos, we'll be learning how to use functions in JavaScript. So now we're going to begin learning about JavaScript functions. You'll remember functions from Introduction to Programming and how they allow us to store code into reusable bits that we can call later. Now this is really exciting because as we learn JavaScript functions, we'll begin to be able to interact with our web page in a more fun way. Rather than just logging to the console, we'll be able to start actually interacting with page elements, because the way the browser works is it uses functions and events to actually interact with the page. We'll see a little bit more about that as we come up on it, but I just want to show you that as we learn functions, we're actually going to start doing some interesting things and get out of the console and into the page. But before we do that, let's take a little review on what functions are and how they work in JavaScript. We'll be working on this simple HTML page that has a single JavaScript page loaded into it, and we'll be editing those two as we learn about functions. So we have our index.html page, which just has some basic styling, and we're including our functions.js, and our functions.js is empty. So the basic way we can create a function in JavaScript is using the function keyword. And here is the sort of basic syntax we can use to generate a function that will take some sort of action when we call it. So we start with the word function, and you'll notice it highlights blue because function is a JavaScript keyword. The next thing we're going to do in this syntax is give the function a name, and the name should be descriptive of what the function does or what it returns. In our case, I'm going to make a very simple function that calls console.log with some information, and I'm going to have it say hello. So I'm going to call this function say hello. We can name our function using the same rules that we've used for naming variables. We can have letters and numbers, so long as it doesn't begin with a number, and the same special characters apply. So this say hello would be a valid variable name, and so it's also a valid function name. So we have function say hello. I'm going to put a space, and then I'm going to list the parameters or arguments that my function can take. A function is able to take in different arguments that will be variables passed in that allow us to change the behavior of our actual function call each and every time we call it. Right now I'm going to leave it blank, being empty parentheses, but even though it's taking no arguments, we still need to have our parentheses in place. So I have our parentheses, and then I'll put another space, and we'll begin our curly braces. And the curly braces delimit the body of our function. So we'll open it up right there. And now we have a basic empty function. Now I want it to actually do something, so let's make it very basic and use the familiar console.log, and it'll say hello world. So we have a basic function called say hello, and the body of that function is a piece of code that says console.log hello world. So what happens if we run this in our page? Let's flip to our browser. I'm going to refresh, and let's open up our console. And right now we see nothing in our console. However, if we start typing say hello, you'll see it auto-completed. And what we can do is actually call this function. And the way we call the function is by giving its name and then using parentheses immediately after it. Now these parentheses are where we pass in the values we want to assign to our arguments. But remember, say hello doesn't take any arguments yet. So it'll be an open parenthesis and a closed parenthesis. And if we execute that code, you'll notice that the console.log has written hello world to our console. And we see this extra line here saying undefined. You'll remember that our console will tell us the value of the previous expression given. Now when we called say hello, it's evaluated to undefined, and we'll see what that means a little bit later. But basically, every time we call a function, some sort of value is evaluated from it, and we can control what that is. But in our case, we haven't returned anything, and we'll see what that means in a second. But right now, we can just say that when we call say hello, the value that it evaluates to is undefined. So we can call it in our console, but we can also call our function anywhere in our code. So what we can do is do say hello. And now that we've called say hello after we've defined say hello, if we refresh our page, immediately we should see hello world logged to our screen. Now the benefit of this is now instead of just calling console.log hello world, we can call it multiple times. So if we want to say hello world in several places in our code, we can reuse this say hello call. So if we save out our script and refresh the browser, we'll now see that every time we called say hello, our console.log code has run. Now this isn't a very useful example. We're really just changing one line of code to be wrapped in a function that we can call later. And that may be helpful, but really where functions are useful are in that they can take arguments and return values. So let's change our say hello function around. Let's say instead of saying hello world, we wanted to say somebody's name. Well, that means every time we call say hello, we need to pass in a different name. So that's what arguments are for, and our arguments are defined after the name of our function. So these are going to be named like normal variables, and they'll act very much like normal variables within our function scope. So let's say our say hello function will take an argument name. So now we have a name variable that's useful inside of our function. And let's see what happens if we add name to our console.log. Now if we refresh, we'll see hello world and undefined. That's because we've defined an argument called name in our say hello function, but we have not passed it in to any of our calls. So let's actually go down and change our first call here and pass in an argument, and we'll say hello Jim. So what will happen is when we call say hello with Jim, when we actually execute the code inside of say hello, name will hold the value of Jim because that's what we passed in this particular function invocation, which means when we do console.log hello world and name, in our first invocation, name will be Jim, so we should see hello world and Jim. And that's exactly what we see. Now we can have multiple arguments being passed to our say hello by separating them by commas. Now, what if I don't want to say hello, but instead have a different greeting? What I could do is create another argument called greeting. Now, instead of saying hello world, let's delete the hello, and the first thing we'll log is our greeting. And let's make sure there's a space there. So what happens now? If I refresh, we'll see undefined, world, and Jim. Now I'm going to change this console.log around. Instead of passing in different arguments to console.log, let's create a string by simply joining our variables together with the concatenation operator here, the plus operator. So now we should get a very similar result. We just have a string. Now we're getting undefined showing up in our strings because our greeting is not being passed to any of our invocations of say hello, and because most of our invocations don't have name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just delete these ones right here. So in this invocation, I will pass in a second argument, and we'll go ahead and just say greetings. And so if we go back and refresh, we now see greetings world and Jim. But what happens if I don't want to pass in a greeting? Well, let's do another say hello. And we'll pass in a name, but no greeting argument. Well, in JavaScript, even though we've defined our function takes 2 arguments, we can pass any number of arguments we want when we actually call it. If we call too few arguments, any arguments that don't have a value will have the value undefined within the function. And if we call too many arguments, well, there's just no argument name to attach to that value. We can still access those extra values passed in, but we'll see how to do that a little bit later. So what happens right now? Well, if we only pass Jim, greeting will be bound to undefined, and given the code, we should see undefined world Jim, and that's not what I want. So we can add a little bit of code here and say if, and the way we can test to make sure greeting is undefined is we could say type of greeting equals undefined. And now we have this if clause, which we've seen before. And so if we have greeting being undefined, what we can do is we can say greeting equals hello. So what we've done here is effectively created a default value for our greeting parameter. So if we call say hello with only one argument, greeting will be undefined, which means we'll define it to be hello. So let's see how that changes our code. We'll save it out and we'll refresh. And now we can see hello world and Jim. So we've seen how functions can take inputs called arguments. In the next video, we'll see how the function can provide an output called the return value.